1422 Radio Great Southern. Well, now, if you mention the word jihad to people, the most popular version of jihad is that it is a holy war being conducted by Muslim extremists against Western countries, in particular the United States of America. And it was a term that I suppose was coined after 9/11 with the Al-Qaeda attack on America. But jihad doesn't actually mean that. It means other things. And now we've got a rather fascinating book which has just been released. It's called The Jihad of Jesus. Now, let me assure you, Jesus was not an extreme terrorist, let me tell you. Far from it. But the book's been written by a man called Dave Andrews, who lives in Brisbane, who's done the most extraordinary things, worked in various communities in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, Nepal. He's been a prolific writer. He's been member of this, member of that. He's been a teacher. He's done all sorts of interesting things. And he's joined us on the line from Brisbane today. Dave, thank you so much. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
Well, delighted to have you. Tell us about jihad. Has this been hijacked by extremists, this word?
Yes, I've had Muslim friends for 40 years, and since 9/11, the word jihad has been blazoned on our headlines and has become a byword for terror. And they are extremely disturbed about this because they say, actually, in the Quran itself, they distinguish between the word qitl for war and the word jihad for struggle, so that the two words are quite separate. The word jihad does not mean holy war. And they say that if we really want to understand jihad, we've got to go back to the Quran and go back to an understanding of the word jihad, which is essentially about a struggle for justice. And overwhelmingly, they say the emphasis in the Quran on that struggle is of a non-violent struggle. And where it may be violent, there are strict rules of engagement that would limit it, in fact, to such a degree that would delegitimate all the wars that Muslims are fighting in the name of jihad today, because any struggle that may use force, according to the Quran, has to respect other people of other religions, respect their property, respect their persons, not attack innocent civilians. And once you start to use that kind of criteria, you realise that the word jihad that the extremists use is in a way that's completely contrary to the spirit of the Quran.
All right, so you've now written this book called The Jihad of Jesus. Now, as I said, Jesus was not an extreme terrorist by any means, was he?
No, but he was a radical. And,
oh, yes.
And that's where there's some common ground here, that Jesus was really concerned about injustice in his society, and he wanted to change it. And he was committed to a non-violent strategy of change, and that when you start to use that kind of language, then you start to realize that there's a synergy between the struggle of Jesus and the language of jihad, and that as Muslims and Christians both look to Jesus as the Messiah or the Messiah or the supreme example, then for people who really want to recover a Quranic understanding of jihad, then Jesus is like the supreme example of a non-violent activist for personal and social change.
I think it's fair to say that most people in the Western world have no idea what Islam actually is or what it stands for.
Well, the reality is, in a country like Australia, Muslims make up about 2% of the population. So most Australians aren't going to meet a Muslim. So people don't know Muslims personally. And then what they lack in their personal encounter with Muslims, they make up for in terms of press releases that, for their own purposes, put the most negative spin possible on Islam. And so most people are just terrified by the thought that the Muslims are coming to get us. And so people are actually afraid of actually making connections with Muslims and discovering that they're human just like us.
And the fact is that if you look at Islam and reading through your book, I mean, the revelations there are that it is a very similar religion in many respects to Christianity.
That's right. Judaism, Christianity and Islam are all Abrahamic faiths. All of us, in all of our texts, have verses that would suggest violence, all of us have verses in our text that say we've got to transcend that violence and move from revenge to forgiveness. And so we're all struggling with similar issues.
Indeed so. Now, you have done some most extraordinary things in your life. How did it all begin?
It began by marrying my wife Angie at the age of 20 and beginning to consider how we wanted to spend our lives, and we decided we wanted to do something really useful with our lives. And we had a faith that was quite vibrant. We had values of love and justice that were important to us, and we thought, how could we invest our lives in a way that reflected that agenda for love and justice? And so at the age of 20, we sold our house, gave everything away, and went overseas to work with marginalised and disadvantaged people.
Right. Now, of course, you were a migrant kid from England, weren't you?
Yes, I was. I actually was born in England and came to Australia when I was 10 years old, and settled here. And I'm glad to have come here because my wife's family is a migrant family too. So I came from England, their family came from Greece, and we met one another and married, and we both come from that great migrant tradition in Australia.
Indeed so. All right, now tell me about your experiences in Afghanistan and Pakistan, India and Nepal, because you were there for quite a long time with these international and marginalised communities.
Yes, so we started out in Kabul with an intentional community providing hospitality for people in distress. That was a wonderful time, very formative for us, but we got overwhelmed by the beginnings of the war that started then, that continues today, and we had to kind of jump on the last bus out of town, down through the Khyber Pass, across Pakistan, which on a bus that was so crowded that Ange and I had to sit on the roof rack at the top with the tribal people with their turbans and their AK-47s. We made our way to India, and once we got to India, we thought, wow, why don't we do the same kind of thing that we were doing in Kabul, here in Delhi? And we started an intentional community called Ashiana. We took people in from the prisons and the hospitals and the streets, and we helped them recover some of their sanity, some of their capacity to engage the world more effectively, and then work with those people in the slums and resettlement areas of the city of Delhi, working with the poorest of the poor.
Wow, you've certainly had some interesting experiences. And, of course, back in this country, you've done a lot of lecturing, you've done a lot of teaching, and you've begun a residential community.
Yes, well, when we came back to Australia, we found ourselves in Brisbane, and in the city of Brisbane, in a place called West End, which is a very densely populated area.
Yeah.
At that time, high crime rates. But one of the things that we really liked about it was very multicultural, and we thought, wow, if we're going to do something similar in Australia, we might as well do it here. And so we started an intentional community in West End called the Waiters Union, because we wanted to not set agendas for people, just loiter with intent to be available to help, to use our knowledge and skills to support and resource people. And so we've developed this network of residents in the inner city, working with the most marginalised people in West End, which still includes Indigenous people who are discriminated against, refugees coming to this country who are treated like criminals, and people with intellectual and physical disabilities who still struggle with stigma in the community. Now,
it's fair to say also, of course, that you are a devoted Christian.
I would have always called myself a follower of Jesus rather than a Christian.
Yeah.
After 9/11, my Muslim friends and I were defined over against each other, them as Muslims, me as Christians. And
right.
I'm a devoted follower of Jesus, but I don't think Christians have a monopoly on Jesus, and it's that kind of monopolistic imperial attitude towards other religions that I'm reluctant to associate with. However, yes, I would identify as a Christian.
But the Muslims, of course, recognise Jesus too.
Of course they do. In fact, my Muslim friends, when they come and speak with me in churches, are asked about whether they believe in Jesus, and they say, of course, we're Muslims. There's more in the Quran about Jesus than there is about Muhammad. But most Christians don't realise that.
No.
And one of the things that we've worked on in our dialogue is to try and develop a view of Jesus that's common to the Quran and to the Gospels, so that we see common ground as sacred ground as a starting point for engaging in change.
Now, of course, Jesus Christ did not form Christianity, did he?
No, you can't imagine Jesus sitting down with his disciples one day and say, listen, I want to start a new religion. And I was thinking, of calling it after me, myself, personally. What do you think of that? I mean, it just sounds, such hubris. You can't imagine Jesus saying something like that. Jesus didn't come to bring a new religion. He came to bring life. And I believe he came to bring life to all people of all traditions and all religions, not converting them from one religion to another, but acting as a catalytic, transformative agent within every tradition and religion.
Mm. Well, now, if we go back in history, of course, there's been an awful lot of conflict, war, killing, a lot done in the name of religion, Christianity particularly.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's actually where we should start.
Indeed so.
Start with a recognition of the 1,000 years of conflict. And as a Christian, I follow the example of Jesus, and he said, take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of somebody else's. So rather than demonize other people, I need to reflect the diabolical character of my own tradition and the atrocities that we have committed. And the reality is, when you look at the history, you can see very clearly that every atrocity that ISIS is committing today is something that Christians have committed previously against Muslims. So if we're going to start to deal with the evil, the violence that's there, we need to begin by critically reflecting on ourselves. And in fact, my Muslim friends and I have made an agreement that I don't criticise Muslim extremists, they don't criticise Christian extremists, but we support each other to critically reflect on our own religions. Because if we criticise one another's religions, we just escalate the conflict. But if we support each other to do the criticism in-house, within the family of our own religion, it's much more likely that we'll be able to confront the issues and deal with them successfully.
Well, of course, the Christians, go back to the emperors of Rome, they started it, and the popes took over, and it was all about power, wasn't it?
Yeah, all about power, and this is the tragedy, that the rhetoric of Jesus, who was committed to empowering people and not overpowering people, was taken as a language that was used to disempower people. And so we've actually constructed a religion in the name of Christ that is the exact opposite of what Christ actually taught.
Indeed. And, of course, the power of Rome was absolutely immense, wasn't it? Because, they controlled huge, vast amounts of land, money and people.
Yes, and within a few centuries, the Christian church had managed to co-opt that and managed to gain access to a lot of that land and resources themselves.
Indeed, and of course we saw those crusades that went through the Middle East, well, in Europe first and then to the Middle East and what have you. And it's interesting to reflect on the numbers, if you like. And I think in your book you say Christians have actually killed more Muslims and Jews than Muslims have killed Jews or Christians.
Well, that's right, and that's continuing today. Was the Twin Towers catastrophe something that was awful? Absolutely. The death of 2,000 or 3,000 innocent people is a terrible tragedy. But then when we retaliated and we invaded Iraq, we killed over 100,000 innocent civilians, 50 times as many. So if what the Muslims did to us is bad, then what we did to them is 50 times worse.
Indeed so. And of course, Christianity in that time has spread, 50% of the world is Christian and Muslim, is it not?
Well, that's the whole point. The reality is more than 50% of the world's population is Christian and Muslim, and therefore, if we don't find a way of living in peace with one another, we're going to end up killing one another and killing a lot of innocent bystanders in the process.
Indeed. And of course, if you look at the history, not just the church itself promulgating wars and what have you, but various characters involved, people like Christopher Columbus and all those Spanish explorers and what have you, who killed thousands of people in South America.
Oh, the atrocities are diabolical. The way that we, in the name of mission and evangelisation, actually slaughtered indigenous populations is horrendous to consider.
Indeed. And then, of course, the Holocaust, and one can't forget that from World War II.
Yes, and while Christians might like to say that that was something that happened under a Nazi regime that was not Christian, a lot of the research, particularly by Goldhagen, shows that it was possible because a compliant Christian population cooperated with Nazism because, well, for two reasons. One, an anti-Semitism that had been nurtured by Luther all the way through, and a submission to authority that had been taught by churches to domesticate Christian populations. And the combination of anti-Semitism and submission actually meant that a majority Christian population actually collaborated willingly in the destruction of Jewish people.
In more recent times, of course, we saw that dreadful genocide in Rwanda, and it's quite obvious there that some of the leaders, who were Christian and indeed Protestant and what have you, simply didn't speak out against those killings because, well, they promoted genocide for their own reasons.
Well, that's right. I mean, the slaughter in Rwanda was very instructive for Christians because the propaganda that we as Christians constantly run is that the idea if everybody became a Christian that there'd be a better world. Well, in Rwanda you had a majority Christian population, probably the greatest percentage of identifiable Christians of any country in the world. And yet, when that genocide occurred, people were slaughtered at faster rates than the Jews were fed into the ovens as Auschwitz. And it was just a brutal genocide used where people just used machetes and hoes and thighs to slaughter over 1 million people. And religious people, Christians across the spectrum, not only participated in that, they actually promoted that, except for the Quakers and the Seventh-day Adventists.
Now, whilst we can talk about what Christians have done in terms of genocide over the centuries, the Muslims too, of course, were guilty as well.
Oh, horrendous. No one comes out of this with clean hands. We've all got to look at the blood on our hands and ask ourselves, why is this so?
Yes, it's a very good question. But it's very interesting, you know, that Muslims contributed to our community and to our well-being in many ways in the fields of medicine and things that people don't even know about.
Yes, well, I come from a Christian tradition where we love to kind of talk about the importance of the Reformation, but we forget the Reformation was built on the Renaissance, and the Renaissance was actually a movement of enlightenment that was based on a lot of literature that the Muslims had saved and then reintroduced back into Europe. When Christians had actually burnt a lot of those documents previously. So we are actually, in spite of the hostility between our religions and in spite of the blood on both sides, we, as Christians, owe an enormous amount to Muslim scholarship.
Indeed. And, of course, this character called Al-Zahrawi, who was known as the father of surgery. I mean, he invented, if you like, and used a whole range of medical equipment that is still being used today.
Extraordinary examples, and to see the contribution not only in surgery but in universities and education, and the role of women in education as well as men at that stage was exemplary.
And yet we hear, again, probably propaganda, how badly Muslims treat their women.
Yes, well, all my Muslim friends would actually say that that is cultural rather than religious, and that it's because many of the cultures where Islam is strong are cultures that are traditional, patriarchal cultures where misogyny is a way of life. And they actually would argue that if those Muslims took the Quran more seriously, they would challenge the oppression of women. So my Muslim friends, in fact, as people who take the Quran very seriously, would describe themselves as Islamic feminists. They really believe that if you take the Quran seriously, you take a commitment to love and justice seriously, and that means gender equity. You've got to take that into account. You've got to advocate for that strongly in the face of misogyny.
What about the role of politics in Islam?
Well, that's a big debate. So there are obviously some Muslim scholars who actually advocate that true Muslims need to develop a Muslim state or a caliphate, which is what the people who are advocating the Islamic State are actually saying. But there are other Islamic scholars that say, hang on, that's actually not Quranic at all. The whole emphasis in the Quran is on a personal, social movement that does not impose religion on another, and therefore they would describe the development of an Islamic state as something that's contrary to Islam, and they would say that in fact it's a fitna or it's an evil. It's something done in the name of Islam that actually gives Islam a bad reputation. And the Muslim friends that I'm involved with and some of the Muslim scholars that I'm in conversation with would emphasize very strongly that Islam, in Quranic terms, is a movement that's committed to profound transformation with a concern for love and justice that would challenge this idea of Islamic imperialism.
Well, of course, to all intents and purposes, Iran is an Islamic state, is it not?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yes, to all intents and purposes, Iran is an Islamic state.
Yes, it has been, and it's been very oppressive. And there's a lot of Iranians that are still seeking refuge in other countries because they're fleeing the persecution that they experience in the Islamic State. And some of my Muslim friends in Australia would say, rather than fear the Muslims coming to Australia, we should welcome those people coming to Australia because they're in a good position to critique Islam. But they can't critique Islam in Iran, but in a country like Australia where there's democracy, there's a safe space for a critical reflection on their religion. So if we actually want to see Muslims engaging their religion in a critical way that's going to be committed to love and justice, then we need to welcome Muslims to our country, provide a safe space for them to critically interact with their religion.
And of course, Iran, Iran is on record as saying that it wants to destroy the state of Israel. Now, that, of course, is not in the Quran either.
Absolutely not. In fact, it's forbidden. The Quranic views are that they should protect people of other religions. In fact, they should be not just protect them as people, but protect their property. So this notion that you annihilate your infidel is actually not a considered Quranic position.
No, and of course there is a great deal of concern about the so-called agreement that the United States and other countries have now got with Iran about nuclear weapons. And there's some resistance from the Iranians, obviously, about investigation and making sure they don't get into military sites and all that sort of stuff. There's still a world concern about the fact that they might get nuclear weapons and they might use them against Israel.
Yes, and I think you and I probably both remember when there were those kind of concerns in the Cold War, and America and Russia were making agreements to limit their nuclear weapons. I think that in spite of the risks associated with it, it's better than the alternative.
Yes. Of course, one has to say that the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, is probably the best intelligence service in the world, and I have no doubt that if they get a sniff of the Iranians making nuclear bombs, then Israel will blow the hell out of them.
I think there's a good chance that you might be right.
All right, let's turn now to what Jesus preached, and you've called this book The Jihad of Jesus. What did he say? What did he preach? What did he want?
Well, the great sermon of Jesus was the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
And the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes. And I would suggest that Jesus practiced the blessed revolution of the Beatitudes. And there are 8 statements there. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And I believe that he calls us to identify with all those who struggle and suffer in spirit. And then he says, "Blessed are those that mourn." And I believe that he calls us to enter empathically into the struggle of those who suffer. And then he said, "Blessed are the meek, who get angry about the injustice done to those who suffer, but who never get aggressive." And then he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, who channel the rage for change into creative ways of working for justice in society." And then he said, "Blessed are the merciful." And said, but if you want to struggle for justice, you need to do it in a way that begins with the idea that to treat people justly means extending the same kind of mercy to others as what you would expect yourself. And then he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart," people who act with integrity, not for the publicity. And then he said, "Blessed are those that are the peacemakers, who in the midst of war commit themselves to engage non-violently, that don't treat other people the way they treat them, but treat them the way they would like to be treated. They respond proactively, not reactively." And he finishes with the statement, "Blessed are those that suffer for their struggle for justice." And the whole emphasis of Jesus was, of course, a willingness to absorb suffering rather than inflict suffering. And I believe that framework is a creative framework for engaging poverty and violence. And it's a framework that I believe Christians and Muslims can accept. Indeed, when I wrote my books on the Beatitudes, I actually asked my Muslim colleague Nora to read the books and to launch them, because I said, I want people to know that Jesus is for all people of all traditions and religions, that Christians don't have a monopoly on Jesus, and I'd like you as a Muslim to launch these books. And she said, "I'd be happy to." And at the launch, she said, "You may think it's strange that here I am, a Muslim woman in a hijab, launching a book by a Christian, but I want you to know that I think the way that we can be truly servants of God is to practice the Beatitudes of Jesus, because this is a radical framework for engaging the poverty and violence of our times."
But how do we combat the extremism that we're now seeing in the world from groups like ISIS?
Well, one alternative is try to bomb them into oblivion.
Yes, well, the Yanks are trying to do that, yes.
The difficulty with that is that it only strengthens the opposition. Because even if you win militarily, you're going to lose ideologically. I was just recently in Pakistan working with some aid agencies, and they were saying how up in the northwest frontier, when they send in the drones to target an extremist, for every single extremist that they kill 28 innocent civilians.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to be Einstein to realize that is the best recruiting strategy for the extremists that you can devise. I mean, the outrage that people feel is channeled into jihad, and a lot of those people are not committed to a non-violent jihad; they're committed to a violent jihad, and so it's counterproductive. So I believe we need to find an alternative, and the alternative is to reach out to the extremists, to embrace the extremists, to treat them the way we want to be treated, and work towards transforming the relationships. In fact, there's a recent book being printed called Making Friends with the Taliban, about a friend of mine who actually in Afghanistan reached out to the Taliban and developed friendships. And you can actually see change in the Taliban through the development of these friendships. The Christians in northern Pakistan are actually making a commitment not to pass on information to the secret services in Pakistan that's then passed on to the Americans to bomb these people. They're actually developing friendships with these people, even though they have been persecuted themselves. They're not returning evil for evil, they're returning good for evil. And in the context of those friendships, they're actually beginning to serve these people. They're actually providing health care for the families of these extremists in order to build a bridge across the chasm of suspicion that's there. Because it's only as we come together as humans and we have conversations and is there any hope of conflict resolution?
But how do we combat the radicalisation of young Muslims, particularly in this country? Now, we've seen a lot of them, somewhere between 50 and 100. I mean, that's not a big number by any means, going to America, going to over to ISIS. We've seen, one's arrested here. We've seen one young fellow killed. We've seen another bloke killed in that siege in Martin Place, and others arrested for terrorism activities. How do we prevent the radicalisation of these young Muslims?
Well, many of our anti-radicalisation strategies are equally counterproductive, because if we target Muslim young people and try to fix them, that just reinforces the sense that they are being alienated, they are being manipulated, and that actually will be counterproductive. The thing that we should emphasise is not anti-radicalisation, but inclusion, welcome, friendship, education, opportunities, so that they have a sense of being part of our society, so they feel that they can call Australia home and that they are committed to the commonwealth of this country like any of us. There's always going to be psychopaths in every community. Every community has its 1 to 2% of psychopaths, and we need to deal with those people in terms of psychotherapeutic interventions and law and order. And we've got those things already in place. We should use that. But the overwhelming influence that we need to actually engender is a welcoming, integrated, inclusive society. So all these Muslim young people feel that this is they have a place among us. They have a stake in this society, and so that they want to be committed to it and to its welfare.
And one would appreciate that is the aim. But if it doesn't work, is there likely to be a backlash from Australians against Muslims, do you think? I mean, is that possible?
Well, the point is there's a backlash already, because there's constant stories in the media that constantly suggest that, the Muslims are coming to get us. And therefore, there are frequent attacks against Muslims. I live in Brisbane. The first mosque burnt down anywhere in the world after 9/11 was in Logan.
Yeah.
In recent times, after highly publicised attacks by Muslims, then local Muslims are attacked, even though these people are completely innocent. And the people that are most likely to be attacked are the young women who are more vulnerable because they're more visible. They're wearing a hijab and people attack them. They abuse them, they swear at them, they physically assault them. One young Muslim woman in my community was walking past the pub. The guy came out with a lighter, tried to light her hijab. Another one was tracked into a house and somebody tried to choke her with her hijab. So that scapegoating behaviour is already there. Now, if we can develop connections between people and relationships between people and friendships with people, then we reweave the broken threads in our community and we provide a strong safety net to deal with the stress and the tension. But if people don't know one another, if they don't have no regard for one another, even the smallest issue will become a big issue, and it's easy to mobilise a mob to attack vulnerable, innocent people.
Yes, well, in many respects, of course, I mean, Australians and many people in the Western world really need re-educating about what Islam is all about, that it is not a religion to be feared.
That is true, but we also need to acknowledge their fear and help them find ways of overcoming their fear.
Absolutely.
Because unless we actually help people overcome their fear, they're not going to be able to take the risk to reach out to develop relationships with Muslim people.
And of course, the media doesn't help, does it? Because it's the terrorists that hit the front page.
Well, the Media Watch recently did a review of 5 major front page stories in the Australian media and showed 4 of them were completely false, and 1 was partially false. And yet when the retractions came out, they were on, page 10,
20, 30. Yes.
And yet the rest of the population was still left with the impression that the Muslims in their community were committing these atrocities when they were all untrue.
Mm. Your aim is to reclaim Jesus as a model of non-violent struggle.
That's right.
Do you think you can be successful?
Well, for people from my tradition, it's not a question of whether I'm successful or not. It's about being faithful. So the emphasis for me and for my Muslim friends is to take our faiths seriously, to support each other so that we are resolute, to pray for each other so that we can cope with the criticism, to critically engage the extremists in both our religions, and to find non-violent ways to resolve our conflicts. And we are determined to do that. We are committed to do that. I believe every act of truth is a victory over deceit. Every act of love is a victory over hatred. Every act of kindness is a victory over violence. And every risk a person takes to make a stand with grace for justice and peace is a victory in our strong but gentle jihad to make our dream of a better world a reality.
Indeed. It's funny, while I was reading your book, it reminded me of an interview I did a couple of years ago with a bloke called Barry Eaton, who is a psychic intuitive, who wrote a book about the afterlife. And I remember asking him about religion on the other side, and he said, there is no religion on the other side. And I said, well, what about the popes and Muhammad, and what happened to them? Oh, well, he says, they have to be re-educated. And I thought, if we could only re-educate some of our religious leaders in this life without worrying about the afterlife, things might be a bit better.
Well, we all need to be re-educated, and hopefully we can help re-educate one another.
Indeed so. Well, I think this book will go a long way towards that. How widely available is it, Dave?
It's available in Australia. People can get it on Amazon. They can get it on Kindle. They can get it through their bookstores. They can order it through their bookstores. And Morning Star is the distributor in Australia.
Excellent. Well, it is called The Jihad of Jesus, The Sacred Non-Violent Struggle for Justice, written by Dave Andrews, who comes out of Brisbane. It is the most fascinating book I've read in the last 50 years, I have to tell you. And I really enjoyed reading it. And I do thank you so much indeed for your time, and I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Dave Andrews joining us there on the line from Brisbane, here on 1422 Radio Great Southern.